Hello everyone, this is Raven Ironwing and welcome to my channel. The GPU that was lost in the mail for over a month finally arrived. I abandoned all hope and thought it had been stolen, and I ordered the GTX 650 Ti 1GB to replace it instead, and that's the one that we tested out in my previous video with the Pentium J2900 system. But since this GPU finally arrived, this is the RX 550 2GB version. It's an HP OEM card, and we put that in and tested it out, and it actually works way better than this card. So it also uses a lot less power. The maximum power that it draws, the entire system, the maximum power I've seen it draw is about 75 watts, so it uses at least 15 watts less than the system did with this card in under full load. And the performance is so much better, and there are a lot more games that are playable on this card. And it also is still supported by AMD, so you can get the latest AMD drivers for it, unlike this card, which is no longer supported by NVIDIA. So let's go ahead and test it out in some games and see what kind of performance we get. So one of the cool things about this GPU is, first of all, it uses less power at idle, but only at about 27 watts. And you can also adjust the power limit to make it use even less power, but let's go ahead and test it with the default power limits here. Alright, so we'll start out with The Witcher 3. This is on low settings, 1080p, just like it was before with the GTX 650. And the game is surprisingly playable. We are getting frame rates above 30 FPS most of the time. It does have occasional frame drops that are pretty bad, or lag spikes, but it's actually pretty playable. So the frame rates are usually above 30 FPS. So it's a very console-like experience, I'd say, for the most part. In town, the frame rates drop a bit more, but this is definitely way better than how it was with the GTX 650 Ti. And one thing you'll notice is the CPU utilization is way lower. Before, in this game, both the CPU and GPU were at 100%. Now the CPU is it's in the 80s, so 80 something percent. So I would say this is actually playable on this card. So playing The Witcher 3 on the Pentium J2900 at pretty playable frame rates. And before we were using 90 watts, slightly above 90 watts, and now we're only using slightly above 70 watts at the most. So here we are running Fallout 4 at 1080p low settings, and with the other GPU, with the GTX 650 Ti 1GB, this wasn't even playable at all. It was getting about 10 FPS at the most, and now we're getting between 30 and 45 FPS. So it's above 30 FPS most of the time. Sometimes it has some frame drops down into the 25-ish range, but this is actually to the point where you could play the game now. Okay, here we are testing out LEGO Worlds at 1080p low settings, and we can see that we are getting almost 60 FPS. So 56, 59. This is way better of an experience than it was before. And we are only using 60 watts. 60 watts for 60 FPS gaming when we're playing LEGO Worlds. This is a huge improvement. I mean, before it was only getting like 30 FPS at the most, and it was running like a potato at 720p. So this is at 1080p, and it's running very well. Awesome. Okay, here we are at Borderlands 2 at 1080p low settings, and we are getting frame rates above 40 FPS, whereas before 30 FPS was about as good as we could do. It's definitely a more playable experience. We're not getting those frame drops into the 15s like we were before. Yeah, I would say this is quite playable. When there are characters on the screen, it does drop into the 20s sometimes, so we do have some frame drops, but this is overall a much better experience. Alright, before, when we were testing out Valley, it was almost playable, but not quite. And here we're getting frame rates at about 27 FPS. Definitely seems a lot smoother than before though. So it's still not great, but it's definitely better. Quite a bit better. Very close to 30 FPS. And it's way smoother. And the CPU utilization is way lower. We're only at 63% on the CPU. So that is one thing that's really good about this card in comparison. Here we are with Shadow of the Tomb Raider on lowest settings, 1080p. And I'm running these at 1080p because that is actually the resolution the system runs best on, which is kind of surprising. Switching to 720p doesn't make anything run better. But we are getting frame rates that are pretty terrible. I mean, 11 FPS. So this is about the same as what we are seeing with the other video card. It's a bit more stable though. Before we would get much steeper lag spikes, would drop into like 5 FPS. So we're running pretty stably at between, in this area it's actually running faster. Okay, now we're getting kind of cinematic frame rates. So I would say this is actually more playable on this, even though the frame rates aren't much better overall as far as peak frame rates, but the average frame rates are definitely better. It's still very bad, don't get me wrong. This is horrible, but considering this is running Shadow of the Tomb Raider on a CPU that's only using 1.7 watts and total system power at 54 watts, I mean, I've actually beat games with worse performance than this, on systems with worse performance than this. Not that I would recommend it, but yeah, I could actually beat this game with this kind of performance. Not that I would want to. So here we are with Shadow of Mordor on low settings 1080p, and right now I'm getting up to 50 FPS sometimes. So before this would run at about 24 FPS. So this is definitely a better experience. We're getting FPS consistently above 30, so here we have another game that wasn't playable with the GTX 650 Ti, that is playable with the RX 550. I decided to test out Skyrim really quick. On the other video card we were getting frame rates at about 30-ish on average, and here we're getting frame rates up to 50 FPS. Still getting some frame drops, but this is way more playable. Looks like we're averaging in the 40s. Alright, Bright Memory Infinite is a game that ran horribly before. I don't expect it to run well on this, but let's see how it goes. So far we're getting about 30 FPS in this area. Why is the F key not doing anything? Okay, there we go. This is actually running way better than before. So we're getting about 30 FPS. This game is almost playable, that's surprising. Such violence. Here we are running the latest version of Minecraft, and the frame rates are fluctuating quite a bit as it loads in areas. But overall, I would say this is better than before. Still has some frame drops, but I'd say the performance is better. And we're using quite a bit less power. We're only using 40 watts. But for playing Minecraft, for playing older games like Skyrim or Fallout 4, or even The Witcher 3, this system can handle it. So we took a CPU that was never meant to game, that was actually meant for low-end laptops that evolved from the netbooks. It's based off of the Atom architecture, and we made it play some modern video games, and it actually runs them to the point they're playable. So can the Pentium J2900 game? Yes it can, but I suggest you pair it with an AMD GPU like the RX 550. I bet the RX 560 would also work fairly well, probably even better. Because from what we're seeing, the CPU isn't even maxed out all the way in some of the games, like in The Witcher 3. The CPU wasn't maxed out all the way. So there is a bit more room for GPU performance in some games. Anyway, there you have it. I think this is the GPU I will stick with this system. It seems fairly balanced, and we have a very low power draw here, and we can play most of the games that I own on it, as well as it functioning as a guitar amp and a Bluetooth speaker, and all those other things that you saw in my previous videos. So I'm very pleased to see that the original GPU I ordered for this was actually the best pairing of the 3 GPUs that I've tried in it. Well, the 4 GPUs that I've tried in it, if you count the GT 1030 that didn't actually work. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any comments, please put them in the comment section down below, and let me know what you think.